So welcome to the Advertising Hour with me, Scott Colnut, and my guest today, James Mulvany from podcast.co, matchmaker.fm and radio.co. You hold the position of CEO in all of those companies. That's right, isn't it, James?
Basically, yeah. Podcasting cheerleader.
And lovingly created all of those companies based in Manchester?
Yeah, it's all under the same roof. We have different teams working on different products, but we're all based in Manchester city centre in the northern quarter.
Excellent. And an absolute pleasure to have you on. You're my very first guest on this podcast. I hadn't particularly intended for this to be a guest or interview-based podcast. It's actually largely for my own benefit. Kind of, I think in my description for this, I've called it part therapy. Yeah. So it's largely my train of thought and exploring my curiosity. But I was using your platform, matchmaker.fm, and I saw that you had this 30-day challenge. And I couldn't pass up the opportunity to learn from one of the best in the industry, someone that's been involved in podcasting for a long time, that obviously has a passion and ambition to do more in the podcasting space. And for the benefit of anyone listening to this, I've just wrapped up a podcast for another podcast that I host, the Site Visibility Internet Marketing Podcast, where we talked about common obstacles to podcasting and how to overcome them.
Okay.
And in this podcast, we're going to be talking more about what we can learn from the world's most popular podcasts. So really jumping into a discussion with James about the podcasts that he listens to, maybe the podcast I listen to, and what keeps us engaged with podcasts, what keeps us coming back, maybe touching on the future of podcasting. And I guess why James is on the 30-day challenge as well. So if we could start maybe with a little bit of background, James, and just talking, I'm really curious to know, when did this all start for you? Interest in podcasting and then the growth of your companies?
Interesting question, yeah. So, I've always been a radio guy, a radio enthusiast, a bit of a nerdy kid. I wanted to go into radio as a DJ when I was really young, 16, 17. Started doing a bit of that, but then decided that, the career wasn't for me. But at the same time, I was learning to build websites. So I was kind of teaching myself PHP, learning to code, and kind of just fused the two together. So I had a business called Wave Streaming for a number of years, which was basically selling streaming media services to the radio industry. From that, I kind of went off to university, did interactive multimedia, so sort of like a posh term for web design, basically. Don't write any code now, actually, but those sort of early days, I kind of learnt enough to get by and start building some basic products. But it was interesting because we were supplying lots and lots of clients to the radio industry. From that, radio.co came around, and we launched that about 5 years ago. But in probably 2008, 2009, that was my foray into podcasting. I used to share an office with a friend called Steve, who had a sort of marketing company. And we basically just started recording episodes together. It was called Kickstart Profits. It was a business-focused podcast, and it was basically just our kind of ramblings, our musings, and sort of things we were doing about, how to market and sell products and sell our businesses. And, it sort of spawned from there. And that was, say, 2008. It was kind of still a medium which was reserved for enthusiasts, I think, back then, both in terms of recording and listening. Because obviously, to download a podcast onto your iPod back then was a sort of a bit of a ball ache. But we had for us, it was just good fun. I can't remember how we did it. We used WordPress plugin or something to kind of set up the feed. And we probably did it for about a year on and off. And then, of course, annoyingly, it seems to have, that you can still see it in Wayback Machine. But I have lost the episodes. I'd love to listen back to them. I can't find them anywhere. But there we go. That was how I got started. And interestingly, then I sort of focused on radio for a few years. And probably in like 2016, 17, after we launched radio.co, we saw that there was this sort of second boom of podcasting, and it had been sort of neglected. We actually did a podcast for radio.co when we first launched, and we just interviewed loads of people in the industry about different things that they were doing, just as a marketing tool. That probably only lasted, again, about a year. But throughout this time, I've always sort of listened to podcasts on and off. And, we had more and more clients coming to us saying they wanted to sort of build podcasts as part of their strategy for their radio stations. So we thought, let's build this into radio.co. But then we looked at the market as a whole and thought, well, actually, this is such a big, exciting market, a cool place to be right now. It made more sense to sort of roll it out as a standalone platform and obviously link the two together versus building it into radio.co and sort of limiting it just to that audience. So obviously we have lots of radio.co clients who are using podcasting, but lots of podcasting clients who are on podcast.co that aren't really interested in radio. So yeah, they're complementary services, but they are different markets as well.
What for my benefit more than anything, what are the differences between the podcast and radio platforms? What's the biggest differentiators between how they work?
Well, radio.co is really an automation system which will play out music as live. So basically you can create playlists, you can broadcast live from anywhere to anywhere as well. And it sounds as if it's live. So normally, when you think about a radio station, there's not always someone sat there in a studio pressing play for every single song, is there? Especially overnights, for example, they just have a computer doing that. So really what we did is we turned that into a cloud-based product. So it's almost like a radio station in the cloud. And it does everything from, managing your schedule and programming and playing stuff out, as I say, to live broadcasting through to things like tracking who's listening, how long they're tuning in for, and reporting for royalties. And so it's really like a total system. Podcasts, on the other hand, are an on-demand format. So you pre-record an episode like as we're doing now, and then they're distributed out to things like Spotify and Apple, etc. Whereas with radio, you can link to certain directories, but generally speaking, our clients run it on their own websites.
So correct me if I'm wrong. So the background for you, it started in radio, but you saw you saw something in the radio industry that was changing that eventually led to radio.co.
Yeah.
But then through a demand from radio.co customers in podcasting, that helped to launch podcast.co. Is that the journey?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. So radio.co came first, and we launched podcast.co in 2019 after probably about a year's worth of development. As I say, we have two separate development teams because running two different SaaS products, you want to make sure that you keep the momentum on one rather than taking the focus away. So yeah, we have two completely separate development teams working on each product.
And then more recently, which we'll probably touch on it further in the conversation, is Matchmaker.fm, which you, I assume, treat as a separate company as well.
Well, this is. I mean, it's within podcast.co. So it's part of this. It doesn't have There's two different limited companies, if you like. There's radio.co and podcast.co, but Matchmaker, we're treating it like a startup within a startup. So again, we have a sub team that's working on that platform exclusively. Marketing responsibilities are obviously shared. But Matchmaker is really exciting as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're in a really unique position to have seen the evolution from radio, how podcasting then impacted the radio industry. And likewise, I guess, how the radio industry has impacted or helped develop podcasting. I think somewhere that you mentioned there, you didn't use this phrase, but it sounds like your curiosity was piqued more so by podcasting than radio and radio hosting. Is that correct?
I don't know, really. I mean, I'm really passionate about both. And I think one of the interesting things when you look at, say, Global, who own a lot of the commercial radio stations in the UK now, and the BBC, those organisations are massive. They have both invested heavily into podcasting content, and signing famous people, signing celebrities to their sort of networks. They're both growing out their podcast networks. And an interesting story I always think was Gemma Collins. I'm not a huge fan of her or anything, but I just think this is a cool story. I think it was like summer before last. At the start of the summer, she didn't know what a podcast was. By the end of the summer, she had a podcast that was number one, in the entertainment category for the UK. Now, that is just purely driven by her celebrity figure, and I guess a lot of the listeners there probably wouldn't have necessarily been involved with listening to podcasts, but that was right. a good signing for the BBC, and they did something clever there because they've got someone who's obviously got a passionate following and put them in front of a slightly new medium to kind of to accumulate growth. Obviously BBC have launched their BBC Sounds app. Those people then start listening to other BBC podcasts, and I think this is what's happened over the industry to kind of accelerate it over the past couple of years.
In terms of what's interesting to me, in terms of what you just said about Gemma Collins launching a podcast and then kind of growing an audience very quickly, is it just shows how much growth there still is we're yet to see in podcasting, because there are going to be so many niche, whether you call them influencers, celebrities, just niche brands, all of those people that haven't launched podcasts yet, but probably will, and that will bring a whole new audience to podcasting. Is going to be a fascinating thing for podcast growth in the upcoming years, I think. We touched briefly. So one thing that you said, which astounds me, is that podcast.co was only launched in 2019. That's not something I realised.
Yeah.
So it's still very early on in your journey.
Yep.
How has the last year or so been?
Pretty manic, and a lot of fun. And again, we are still growing. We're still a very young company, but we've recently, I can't really go into details, but we've recently signed a really exciting deal to be the exclusive partner of a fairly large record and artist management company in New York. So we're going to be working with them on producing some incredible podcasts with some very high profile people, a lot of people in the hip hop and rap industry.
Something that's very close to my heart.
Yeah, so it's really exciting. So we're interestingly with radio.co, we've always historically just had, been a software company provided solutions to clients. With podcast.co, we've taken a much more holistic approach. So yes, we have the platform. However, we also have a production arm. So we're also working with clients on sort of end-to-end production as well. And we have a couple of studio partners as well as operating our own studio here in Manchester as well, because this is where really the industry it seems to have taken us. We launched it with kind of, and I think it's important as a startup that, you're adaptive and you change. You don't just think, right, okay, we're going to just do this one thing and that's going to be it forever, because you've got to sort of follow the market and kind of carve your own groove. And this is really what we've been doing over the last year with podcast.co. And it's actually right now how the business is nothing like I thought it would be probably 2 years ago when we were starting to sort of concept the platform, work on the project. So we've really, really taken a different direction than I was initially imagining we would. But, that's a great thing. It's an exciting place to be. And, the fact that we're really sort of starting to get somewhere in terms of working with bigger clients. For example, one thing I can talk about is we were working with Samsung back end of last year. I'm hoping we're going to be doing some more work with them this year, but obviously things have changed a bit. We were going to a lot of conferences, tech conferences with Samsung, and helping them produce their podcast. So they were using it as a really awesome brand activation. There's a conference called Slush in Helsinki. This was, I think, November last year. And the Samsung, obviously, they've got big budgets. They have a big fancy stand in the middle of the trade show floor. And we were like, right, let's build a podcast studio into the stand with so people can, obviously there's lots of people coming off stage, interesting speakers. They can get them in there, record a podcast with them. But they were behind glass, so you could see it being recorded. And there was also a row of headphones, so passers-by could actually listen into the conversation as it was being recorded. Really cool brand activation. Perfect way to get people to come and pay attention to your stand as well.
That's that's a really interesting, like you said, brand activation kind of project there. When you touched on the growth of podcast.co, winning new clients. I appreciate there are going to be some things that you can't talk about. So feel free to, if you need to just say, I can't talk about that.
Yeah, sure, of course.
But I am curious about the podcast hosting space, I guess, is fairly competitive. There have been a number of key players in that space for a very long time. But maybe what I'm curious to know is, when you were thinking of and started to launch podcast.co, what were your aims? Because you're going into a fairly competitive space.
Yes.
What did you want? What were your goals to achieve in this space?
Well, I mean, initially it was about looking at what else was out there, and fairly, without naming names, as some of the industry players, they're just dog ugly. They're hard to use. It's just clunky software, and I haven't had any kind of thought of as to the user experience at all. So that was our first goal, because ultimately, our competitors' products and our products all do the same thing, right? But it's just, how could we make ourselves different? Well, to start off with, that was the main thing we focused on, just building a beautiful, easy to use product. Also, one of the things we're good at, and we've always been good at with radio, is content. Creating really valuable, nice pieces of long form content and videos that will help people and kind of cement your brand in their mind. So as we were working up to the launch of podcast.co, the site was actually live for a good year, at least, maybe even a little bit longer, before we took the platform to market. And we weren't selling anything. We were just literally using that year to, start building our rankings on Google and using that year to produce content. So, because again, we made this sort of mistake with radio.co. We didn't really have anything on the site until we launched the product. We just had like one of these landing pages with enter your email coming soon. So we thought with podcast.co, rather than just doing that, let's go one step further, create some content and start building a valuable brand, because actually the brand is where the value sits sometimes, not just on the actual platform. And again, like most of our competitors aren't doing that, or some of them are starting to a bit now. But certainly when we were planning and concepting podcast.co, there was really very little content being produced by the actual industry players about the medium, So stuff like how to record or which equipment to buy, or how to write a podcast script. That's one of the big hitters for our strategy, content strategy. Lots of people searching for that, and they just weren't tapping into this.
Yeah, you touched on several points there, just so listeners know kind of what attracted me to podcast.co. It was actually a couple of those items. I talked about this in an episode we just recorded, and I forgot. I can't remember if I said this at the beginning, but if you want to go check that out, it's at the Internet Marketing Podcast from Site Visibility. Yeah. We were talking about common podcast obstacles, but I was essentially giving you and your team praise for the user interface. It's an enjoyable experience using podcast.co. And prior to that, I've only, I would say, a basic to intermediate level of experience in podcasting, the software that's available. And I agree with you. Dog ugly is the phrase that comes to mind for a lot of other platforms. And so it was a really nice change to feel like podcast.co made podcasting accessible. And that's what attracted and ultimately kept me as a personal customer. And another thing that stands out as you were talking is the content. So, and on that note, I haven't got this written down in front of me, but you released a book. Was that part of the launch strategy as well?
The book? No, we did that. That wasn't part of the launch. I think we launched a book in October called Read This If You Want to Start a Podcast. I have a little confession. I didn't actually write the book, even though it's got my name on it. Okay. Written by the team. So kudos to them for creating a great book. I get to just get all the glory for it, really. But obviously, I had sort of input in it. But yeah, no, it was it just I don't know. It's just part of the brand strategy, part of my personal brand, and also sometimes people like to buy and read a physical book versus just because the thing is, I think the value of ebooks now or PDFs has just sort of gone down. People don't really. They're all over the place. So if you actually have something physically delivered, it just for some reason it just gives it a nicer feel. So yeah, and we sold, I don't know the exact stats, but it was certainly a few hundred copies within the sort of the subsequent weeks after launching. We're doing a couple more books as well actually at the moment. So it's another channel. People are searching on Amazon for content all the time. Supposedly, one of the things I've not tried yet, but I'm looking to do is actually getting these narrated and uploaded to Audible as well, because apparently there's a big opportunity. People are going crazy for audio books now, which again is sort of similar format to podcasting, isn't it? Really?
No, I've not really thought about that. But there's the book. I mean, I purchased one of the books, and I just for the benefit of our listeners, you can grab that at. I think you can get it. You definitely can get it from Amazon because that's where I got it from. Yeah. Can you get it from your website as well? Do you know?
No, but we have a couple of free courses and books. So if you go to podcast.co/blueprint, you can download the podcast blueprint, which is very similar. And also podcast.co/crash course, which is a short video series, which just talks through how to get started. So check out those resources. They're completely free to download, and you can learn lots of good stuff from them. There's lots of nuggets in there.
So it sounds like the intent for launch was to address that gap in the content space. And I use the phrase making podcasting a bit more accessible. It seemed like that was a key part of the strategy when you launched. Yeah. So moving this discussion on in terms of this 30-day challenge. So I guess podcast.co has been going, you launched that company, you said 2019. You're a year and a half, 2 years in, I'm imagining at this point, getting to that point.
Yeah.
And now you're at this point in time where you've just launched Matchmaker.fm in February.
Uh-huh.
Maybe if you could just speak on Matchmaker.fm and your intent for matchmaker.fm and your goals for that company or that project,
Yes.
and this 30-day challenge that you're on, and how's it going?
Yeah, so Matchmaker, to put simply, is we bill it as Tinder for podcasters. So if you're interested in booking guests onto your show, there's lots of interesting folks who with all sorts of areas of expertise on there who are looking to be guests. And likewise, if you want to be a guest on podcasts, perhaps you're launching a new book or you're bringing a product to market and you want to do lots of podcast gigs to kind of get the word out there. It's a way to connect with podcasters who are looking for guests. So the premise is very, very simple. And I'll be honest, it's been one of the most successful launches that I've ever done in terms of user engagement and the growth within the space of time. Now, part of this is because it's completely free. There's no monetization built into it whatsoever at the moment. So you can sign up and use it as much as you want for free. And we'll always have a free plan. Obviously, we will need to monetize it at some stage, but I think we'll try and keep as much of it as free as possible. And it's also been a great funnel to channel people into podcast.co as well, because lots of people who are signing up as guests are actually thinking about starting podcasts. So we're seeing quite a lot of customers coming to us now indirectly through Matchmaker. So that was kind of part of the plan of launching this as well. Using it as another way of funneling and connecting with a wider audience. People who want to be guests, but they're maybe then thinking about doing their own podcast. Well, we are immediately attached to that. I thought to myself, obviously we've been very busy trying to grow the platform, get the numbers up. We're about 3,500 users now. We're about 3 months in. So I'm hoping we can get to 10,000 users within the first 6 months. I think we'll probably smash that actually. It's a good number now where there's lots of people. We've got all these pretty graphs so you can see how many conversations people are having. And what's great to see is actually we're not just building users who aren't using it, they are using it. And I think you mentioned was it at the start, it was probably in the other recording that you've seen some great success with it, which we can go into in a sec. But yeah, so what I'm doing at the moment is to sort of prove this concept to myself and our audience is I'm recording 30 podcasts within 30 days. I'm doing a video which talks through how I've approached this. So if you're thinking about doing a podcast tour, that's what this is kind of called, where you kind of have this focused concentration of let's get on lots of podcasts in a short space of time. How do you actually go about doing that using Matchmaker? And I've kind of put it into a system that really anyone can follow. It's going well. So this is actually number 15, I think. That we're on right now.
And when does this end for you at the moment in terms of the 30 days?
Right, so it's May the 15th now. I started this on the end of April, so I think it was April the 27th. And so I will try. May the 27th is the day before my birthday, so I would like to try and get it wrapped up in time for then, so I don't have to stress about going on more podcasts on my actual birthday. But yeah, I think we're probably well on track to do that, to be honest. And it's been so interesting, the fact that I've had so many conversations, and one of the things that you want to practice what you preach, and one of the bits of content which we created for Matchmaker, which we send out to anyone who signs up as a guest, is try and make each appearance individual. And yes, okay, you might have some common themes that need to run throughout each appearance, but try and make each conversation slightly different. And I was kind of worried that I'd end up having the same conversation 30 times, but actually I haven't at all. I think it's been really good, and we've kind of gone off on all different sorts of tangents. Some have been kind of similar, but then there's been some that have been completely almost like nothing to do with we've obviously, our two conversations have been quite podcasting centric, but then there are other conversations where I haven't really talked about podcasting much at all, to talk a bit more about sales and marketing, or sort of my journey as an entrepreneur. So it's been a real mixed bag. And again, I sort of talk a bit about how to achieve these results in terms of you're not just doing the same thing over and over again in the video, which I'm going to be putting out just after I've finished this sort of challenge.
One of the interesting things, again, you talked about the breadth of topics maybe that you can cover. Ours have been podcasting heavy because I'm trying to be like a podcast vampire and suck all your knowledge away. I'm really interested in it. It's been amazing just hearing all of this from you. But yeah, I was just thinking that one of the reasons that I listen and love podcasts is the diversity of content, on-demand content. And for me, it's a break. I'm a marketer by day.
Yes.
It's a full-time thing for me. It's the thing I think about in the morning, I think about at night, and I do need a break occasionally. And podcast, and I'm not particularly a TV person. I like being, I like exercise. I like moving around, I like doing things. And so it's a really good medium for me just to listen to podcasts. And yeah, I'll listen to things I have absolutely no idea about. I've just been listening to a podcast more recently, which is an interest of mine, but I don't particularly know anything about. And the podcast is called Mafia. I think it's from Audio Boom, and it's a really well produced podcast. I think they launched back in 2018. The history of kind of gangsters and the mafia and stuff like that. And it talks you. It's an interview kind of based and history based podcast that talks you through what was happening at the time with people that were there. And it's just a completely different break. And I think just another thing with podcasting, I'll listen to a podcast. One of the things that got me interested in listening to podcasts, you mentioned hip hop. I'm a huge hip hop fan, have been for a long time. And one of the first podcasts I listened to was Ice-T, who had a big podcast back in the day, let's say maybe 8 to 10, maybe 8 years ago.
Right.
It's called the Final Level Podcast. And he launched a podcast, and occasionally he'd have guests on. And just the introduction of interview-based podcasts to new people and new guests and new industries really helps to diversify your learning. And it gets me out of my bubble, and I start to hear about people who maybe I'd never have thought about, or maybe industries I'd never even thought about. So I like the way in which it expands my knowledge. I guess on that topic, with this, you touched on you've been on a range of different podcasts, been talking about a range of different topics. What are the topics that have stood out to you that you just didn't expect to talk about, but maybe you've launched into?
Well, the one of the podcasts I was recording this morning, I was sort of talking about, it's called The Mind Takeaway, and they're sort of all about, personal development. It's more focused around that. So I was sort of talking about, you have your ups and downs as a career for your entrepreneur. It's all very well saying, yeah, everything's rosy and everything's great now, but I had a couple of bad years where things didn't work out. So I was talking specifically about that kind of journey, and that was kind of quite interesting. That was kind of one of those conversations that sort of caught me out. They were very good interviewers and asking the right questions, which again is great. And I think as a guest, just try and go along with that. If they're asking probing questions, as long as you're happy to talk about stuff, I think you end up talking about things that perhaps you hadn't planned for. But really, that's when I think the beauty and the magic happens, because you have these conversations that just more like natural, aren't they? They're more like you're just talking to someone, and they're not as planned. But then ultimately as well, sometimes people don't like that and they prefer to stick to a structure. I'm kind of really impartial when I'm being interviewed. I'll quite happily go with either route, really.
Yeah, that's something that I'm trying to strike the balance of at the moment. Actually, is it sounds like I'm very similar to you. Is that I've been producing outlines because I feel like that gives my guests reassurance on the podcast I host.
Yeah.
Reassurance, because we talked on the other podcast about video and how that can be quite intimidating, but there still is an intimidation with recording a podcast for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I really enjoy this medium. Because I enjoy it, I think I'm more comfortable with it. And so I don't necessarily feel the need for an outline, but I produce an outline largely. I mean, it is good to have an outline to stick to timings. I found out on another podcast I recorded recently that was terrible with my timing, and my guest had to kind of rush off at the end, and I was a little bit embarrassed by that. So it's good to kind of create an outline to stick to timings.
It is good.
But another thing that
I think it's useful as a host as well to have an outline sometimes, because if you sort of run out of conversation, again, it just depends on who you're speaking to. Sometimes people are easier to speak to, or you just resonate with them better than other people for whatever reason. And I think I've been in a situation before where I've been interviewing someone and I've just not kind of clicked with them, and the conversation hasn't exactly been flowing. And if you don't have those sort of things in front of you, sometimes you start panicking. You're thinking, "Oh goodness, what's this guy's not really chatty?" And what do I want to ask him next? So I think having an outline, or some backup questions. That's what I always do as well. If you run out of, if you do things too quickly, or you just feel like you just want to break the ice a bit more or something, get some kind of little backup questions that you could just throw in.
Yeah, I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm nervous as a host. That's definitely not right. But I'm very conscious that I don't want to make my guests uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to find the balance of at the moment is when to interrupt. I think that's the hardest thing in journalism, in podcasting, and probably radio as well.
Oh yeah.
Is sometimes there's a question on the tip of your tongue and you really want to ask it, but I mean I'm a real believer in the value of just letting guests talk and then kind of waiting and seeing where they go with the conversation. But there are just times where I just want to reach out and be like, you touched on something interesting. I don't really want to forget it.
Just write it down. That's what I tend to do. I just
right.
have a notepad in front of you, and because again, you can allow the guest to lead the conversation. Again, you've got to be careful, haven't you, that you don't go off on too many tangents, because sometimes people will just talk and talk and talk, and they'll end up just going off on something completely, where it's always getting to the point where it's not really that relevant. So, I think if you write sort of little ideas you have down as you're talking, you can kind of, as a host, it's your job to steer things back on track sometimes. I don't think there's any problem with doing that,
Yeah, well, that's a good tip, because I haven't got a notepad in front of me, and there have been moments where, so that maybe that'll be my next addition to my desk, because there are moments where someone will say something and I think I've got to keep that in my mind, because when the guest finishes, that's such an interesting topic, and I want to make sure that we cover that. So thanks for that tip. And funny enough, you were talking about getting back on conversation. I want to make sure that I don't lose this point.
Yes,
is that you touched on Matchmaker.fm and your 30-day challenge. And I just, anyone that's listening to this, I am full of praise for Matchmaker.fm. I found it through the podcast.co platform. I was thinking about launching this particular podcast, and I hadn't intended on this to be an interview-based podcast, perhaps the occasional guest. And I have managed, and I am a host of another podcast, the Internet Marketing Podcast with Site Visibility, and that's an interview-based podcast. And I had always found it difficult to go through we're pitched a lot of guests on that podcast. I've always found it quite difficult to find the right process for finding guests, booking guests on, and knowing really where to start with that whole process. It can be, I guess, quite time consuming. It's not the area of podcasting I'm most interested in terms of the administration side of finding guests and interesting people to talk about or talk to. And Matchmaker.fm makes that a breeze. I signed up. It took 5 to 10 minutes to create a profile as a podcast looking for guests. And I hadn't even launched this podcast yet, put up my profile, put up what the podcast was about and what I'd intended to talk about. And I think I had 10 to 15 messages, maybe within the first day. This was a couple of weeks ago. And the guests and the breadth of topics, it's just, I'm really excited to get started. I've obviously your 30-day challenge came up, and that's something that I kind of wanted to snap up that opportunity. Yeah. But there are so many other guests that I'm looking forward to talking to. And we touched on the diversity. There are, ex-Marines. I think I've got someone that's managing a women's basketball team coming on, and all in the area of talking about. My intent is to talk a little bit more about advertising, marketing, business, entrepreneurialism in those spaces. But I'd encourage you, if you're thinking about launching an interview-based marketing podcast, or you have one already and you're struggling to find guests, or you just want to make that process easier, go check out Matchmaker.fm. And it's really good to hear you've had a really successful launch so far. And I imagine there's so much more in the pipeline when it comes to that product and the roadmap. Actually, maybe if just as we're on that, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, sure.
The launch has gone really well. What are you planning to add to Matchmaker.fm over the next 6 months to year or so?
Great question. I think, one of the things we've been doing over the past few months is really just reacting to what users have suggested. So if there's things that we've missed out, or little things that we kind of built the product as like an MVP, really. So we're sort of growing it as and when what people are sort of saying to us, if there's obvious things we've missed. So like one of the things was, we added was ability to actually set your profile to away, because it didn't occur to us that actually people don't necessarily want to have requests all year round. They might want to just say, take a bunch of requests on and then, get those recorded. So we introduced away mode, things like adding favorites. So if you're building a campaign for a podcast, having favorites, so either just having like a little heart symbol, or maybe even be able to create favorite lists. Another request we've had, which we are looking to do, again, this will be sort of part of the monetization strategy for the product, is allowing agency profiles. So we have had quite a number of PR companies, influencer agencies, marketing companies who represent lots of folks. So they will represent, public speakers or entrepreneurs, and they will be tasked with, getting the gigs on podcasts and getting them publicity. So having ability to sort of manage multiple profiles on behalf of your clients, that's something we're going to be adding in. One of the other features which I think at the moment, you have this ability to sort of write like a tagline or an elevator pitch. So when you're browsing guests, you hover over their profile and you can see, I think it's 100, it's like the same number of characters as a tweet, I think. So you can basically just say what that person's about, what their area of expertise, and it's completely up to that person to sell themselves in the best way possible with this, just in one sentence. And that's just really to allow people to quickly whittle through people and just see who's going to be a good fit for them. But one of the things I think which would be fantastic to add, and I think it's going to be on the roadmap already, is ability to actually just record a little like elevator pitch. So basically, when you hover over that image, you're not just seeing text, but you can actually hear the person speaking about themselves. Because
that's a great idea.
Ultimately, we're introducing people for podcasts, so it's about audio. So it needs to link into that. Again, one of the features we've added, again, didn't occur to us when we built it. We've now added ability so a podcast can list the total number of downloads they get per episode. Again, what we will be doing is validating this information further down the line. So when we sort of start implementing some monetization, because obviously this has got to be a manual process, because there's no way to see how many episodes, how many downloads a podcast has actually had. We're just going on a trust basis, but it's occurred to me that obviously this is quite easily, people could just put whatever they want there. So one of the things we're thinking about doing is having like a sort of validation. So if someone says that they get 10,000 downloads an episode, having a manual check where they can send us a screenshot of their stats, and then they get a little, a verified icon against their profile, so we know that they, are getting that many downloads. So, again, I think I want to try. At the moment, my concern with doing this is it's at the moment it's a very level playing field. So, we're not just getting a few podcasts that get the most downloads, are getting the most inquiries. And I think that's kind of like the way of doing it. But we have had a number of people say to us, well, I want to see how many downloads a podcast is getting. So again, I think that might be part of the monetization strategy. If you're paying for a premium guest profile, you can see that data that we've verified. And if you've got a free guest profile, perhaps you can't, just to keep it fair. So, people who are maybe just starting out can still get bookings, because that's the thing. It's very important to me. I think we're giving everyone a chance here to succeed. So, that's just a bunch of stuff off the top of my head. I'm sure we've got other things in the roadmap as well. But yeah, for me at the moment, the first 3 months has been about, getting traction, getting people using the platform. And it's interesting to see that the line on our graphs showing number of users is in line with the number of messages being sent. So the more users we are getting on board, the more messages that are being sent, which makes sense. So that was kind of like one of our things. We're thinking, right, if we build this platform and no one uses it, well, then what's the point, So people are engaged. And I think from what you've just said, it's good sort of testimony there that, if you sign up, you can get bookings, and it is an effective medium, which is fantastic. Me as an entrepreneur, that's the gold there. I'm like, wow, I'm making these connections for people, or that our platform is enabling people to make these connections, I should say, that otherwise they might not have made. And that's really rewarding, I think. So yeah, and again, it's one of these things. We built Matchmaker because we wanted a way to stand out from a lot of the other podcast hosts. Ultimately, they're all doing the same thing. So this was one of our things. We thought, right, well, let's do something that's kind of complementary to our service. But ultimately, we can use it to convert potentially other people who've got podcasts with other hosts. We can get in front of them and show them that podcast.co is a potentially a better way of hosting your podcast, and we can convert them as customers, but also guests as well. So, hopefully it's going to continue sort of being a really fruitful source of customers for us for podcast.co as well.
Yeah, I'm really excited for some of those features on matchmaker.fm. Like you said, there are some other kind of podcasting interview-based, you've just reminded me actually. So one, a very long time ago, I had the idea, but perhaps not the expertise to do something along these lines, and I purchased the domain guestpodding.com, which I've never done anything with, but it's one of those. The reason I mention it is because it has been a problem, I think, in this podcasting space for a long time to find an efficient, a useful, maybe even a community-based platform where people can share and invite and find guests for their podcasts. So loads of those features you've just mentioned, I think sound really interesting and will be really, really useful. The one that stands out to me that I'd love to see, because this is one of the things that always happens already, is you start off the conversation about a podcast, and then someone wants to take it off of the platform and to like Calendly. So I'd love a Calendly integration or something like that somewhere down the line.
Yeah, I mean, that again, it's one of the things where we're sort of thinking, do we build this style functionality into the platform even? If we're going to actually be full service, we could actually have a calendar built right in. But then obviously a lot of people already rely on tools like Calendly. So having an integration is probably where we'll go, just because it's going to save us a lot of time. And building a calendar system in itself is quite a complex beast with time zones and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's definitely been discussed already. Again, I think sometimes in the podcasting space, you'll be familiar as a marketer. There are lots of marketing tech tools that all integrate with each other, or they're linking with Zapier. So we built an integration. I think we're the first podcast host that actually integrates with Zapier.
Yeah, I remember seeing it.
Yeah, and just because it's right, you can link in with so many other platforms there. I think building integrations is perhaps a way to go, rather than trying to do everything yourself as a business. So, and it's very, very common in the marketing world. Lots of tools we use, like Intercom, for example, and Calendly and Zapier. They all link together in some way, shape, or form. So you can kind of use them to sort of connect with other tools. So I think integrations are always much easier to build than actually building that functionality yourself. And if you were linking with a product that does a dedicated purpose, it's going to be 10 times better anyway.
So for anyone listening, again, to maybe repeat myself, is if you're launching a podcast or you've got a podcast already, you're looking for guests, you're looking to be a guest, check out matchmaker.fm. Currently free. As James said, there'll be paid versions into the future, but it's a great way. I can attest to this, is it's a great way to start finding guests quickly. I'm going to switch the conversation slightly, just on the topics of lessons from podcasting and the world's most popular podcast.
Yeah.
And we were talking just before I pressed the record button, is I'm really curious to know someone that's involved, and we talked at the beginning, you've been involved in radio and then into podcasting for such a long time now, over a decade-ish, maybe a bit longer. What are some of the podcasts that you listen to, and do you get time to listen to podcasts? So you're doing so much in the podcasting space. Is that still something that is that still a daily experience for you? You have your own podcast that you like and listen to?
I do have several. My listening behavior isn't, and I think it's the same with how I watch TV. I'm not the sort of person that can easily get bought into like Netflix series. So I tend to listen pretty erratically, and I listen to lots of odd episodes here and there that catch my attention. And they might not necessarily be podcasts that I'm subscribed to, but I will tune into them. And again, I'm always looking at what clients are doing. And quite a lot of the time, I'll end up listening to a lot of customers' podcasts, because it's just interesting to be connected and understand what people are using the platform. But some that I've listened to on a regular basis, Masters of Scale, if you're talking like huge podcasts, that's really good. I've listened to a bunch of episodes on that. There's a podcast that's less known, but I think it's pretty cool, by a guy called Frank Kern, called Your Next Million, which is good. It's just lots of marketing advice. He's the guy I've actually followed for a number of years, so pretty good. And another one, I used to read a lot of personal development books when I was a lot younger, and Paul McKenna is someone that I've always followed, and he's got a cool podcast called Positivity, which is actually produced by Global, who own Capital FM and Radio X, etc. And he obviously has access to some really big A-list celebrities, so there's some really good interviews on there. And then aside from that, there's lots of like industry kind of geeky podcasts that I've listened to on and off over the years, which are focused in on radio or podcasting. I've never really been one to get into, like, my dad wrote a porno that everyone seems to go on about. I tried to get into that, and I couldn't for some reason. I'm just not.
Same, actually. Yeah, I couldn't.
But again, it's different things for different people, isn't it? I think there's, people always ask me that question: what podcast do you recommend? I'm like, well, just what's good for me isn't good for everyone else. And again, I don't always take a note of every single thing I listen to, but I'm always listening to. But as I say, I think my behavior as a listener is quite erratic. I will just, because I'm exposed to so many constantly, just by the nature of what I do, I'm just tuning in and tuning out and tuning in and tuning out all the time, rather than saying, right, I'm going to listen to an entire series of one podcast. It's just how I consume them, really.
That is interesting. It's a very interesting user behavior. Sorry, you were going to carry on.
The other thing that's been a common sort of trait as well is there are quite a lot of music podcasts, which again don't really seem to get a lot of talk. Don't get talked a lot about within the industry. Like, for example, Eric Prids has Epic Radio. I'm a big house music fan, so that's one I've listened to, for years. So again, you can get some really good music based podcasts, generally DJ mixes and house mixes, because that's my thing. Again, but that's it basically. Yeah.
I don't know if this is true, maybe you'll know, maybe you won't. But what I've been fascinated by during this pandemic at the moment is the from a marketing perspective, is this from musicians launching IG live sets.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's transferred over to podcasts, but I imagine it will happen. But it's been really fascinating to see. I mean, again, I'm involved and interested in the hip hop space, and so the number of hip hop artists that have just gone and started to launch IG live sessions. There's been the versus battles recently. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those. DJ sets as well. I imagine that will eventually translate its way to podcasting as well, and people taking those mixes and putting that into podcast form. Because at the moment it's on IG Live, so it's really difficult to then follow up at a later date.
Yeah, and again, you've got to capture. The thing is with doing these live streams, you've got to capture people, and not everyone has that time to sort of devote an hour or whatever to watching your favourite set. But they have. You're right. People streaming these sets from their kitchens, DJ sets, or musicians or singers. I've seen a number of them, and they seem to get quite decent audiences. But it's interesting. They wouldn't have done that before, but I think it's important, especially if you've got that sort of public image, to keep your fans engaged in a period where you might not be releasing as much. I'm not fully aware of how it's impacted the music industry. Obviously, there's still songs being released, but I guess if the longer it goes on for, are we going to get to a position where the catalogue sort of starts to dry up, and actually there's a period where there's not that much material going out? I don't know how in advance the music industry operates, but it's an interesting question anyway.
Yeah, I'm not too sure either. But I just realised that there probably is a gap to take all, because I've missed out on so many of these live Instagram sessions and other platforms, YouTube sessions and stuff, and there's maybe an opportunity to capture that content and then turn that into a podcast format for people to catch up on at a later date.
You could really easily do that, couldn't you? There's no reason to stop you turning an Instagram TV video. I'm sure there's some way of downloading it. You're probably not supposed to, but you probably can get it downloaded and convert that into an audio file. Why not? Easy way of cross-purposing content there, right?
Yeah, it is. And your listening behaviour is, again, you're surrounded by podcasts. It's very different to mine. It was going to be one of my questions for you, actually. So I have, I don't know, I use Google Podcasts as my app. I may be subscribed to about 30 podcasts, but the ones that I listen to more religiously, I really listen to. I look forward to the episodes that are coming out each week. They're I said I listen to Mafia, which is a season-based podcast. Another season-based podcast, again, it's a hip-hop related one. Two DJs, producers, Stretch and Babito, they're in the hip-hop space. They've been in that space for a long time. They've released two seasons of their podcast. They're about to launch a third. But I listen to some comedy-based podcasts as well, where they're kind of weekly episodes. And in preparation for speaking to you, I was thinking, what is it about some of those podcasts which it reminds me of back in the day before we had streaming, and I'm a big music fan, so I would love album releases. I'd love the day I could go to get that new album, look through the notes and the sleeves. And it feels a bit that way to me at the moment with podcasting. I really look forward to the next episode, and I'll tune in religiously to some. Even if your listening habits are maybe slightly different to mine, are there any trends you noticed in, I guess, what is what I just said? Does that sound familiar to you? Is that what you hear from other podcast listeners, that almost obsession, that loyalty to podcasters?
Yeah, I think it's mixed. It's just like everything, isn't it, Scott? Like, I think there are people who are really obsessed and kind of will listen to every single episode, and there's other people that will just sort of duck and dive and choose different ones. I think that's the beauty of the medium, really. There's sort of no right or wrong way of listening to podcasts. I think in terms of comedy, it's quite widely known that that's the most successful. Comedy and sports are the ones that seem to be leading the way in terms of categories. And
I actually didn't know that for comedy. That's really interesting.
Yeah, comedy and sports. I think they get, and sort of entertainment. Those are the sort of top three heavy hitters. Again, most of the podcasts I listen to are either music or factual sort of based. I don't really listen to any of these sort of story timey ones, like Serial, that sort of stuff, just because it's just not for me, And again, I can't get into Netflix series when it's 12 episodes long. I haven't got the attention span, to be honest, all the time. So I don't think there's any right way sort of consuming them. But the thing with podcasting and what we see with the statistics on our platform is that most people will download each episode. Now, whether or not that's just the nature of how iTunes is or Apple Podcasts as it's now known works, it'll automatically, once you subscribe, it will download each episode. Again, there's a bit of a disconnect there because they're still not. Each of these platforms has their own stats, and we have our stats, but we can't see inside what's going on iTunes, for example, or Spotify. So we don't quite often know how long people are actually listening to an episode for. And again, this is one of the frustrating things about the way this ecosystem of this industry is. There's no sort of unified way. There's been lots of attempts to try and get everyone on the same page, but there is not yet one main way to sort of track listening and engagement. So I think it slowly will start changing because, as I say, there's more money being put into the industry and bigger players are kind of focusing on it, and there's a lot of advertising now. So there needs to be a better way of doing it. But yeah, I think overall, like, listening's steady. I mean, we see tiny little podcasts coming on board with podcast.co, and within a few months, they're getting a couple of hundred downloads an episode, or sometimes even more. We work with a client called IFL TV, and they had a pre-existing audiences about boxing, basically.
Yeah, I'm aware. I saw that. That's amazing.
Yeah, so they obviously have a big, successful YouTube channel, lots of viewers. They have an audience. So, of course, when we worked with them on launching the podcast, they made a success of it very quickly and got the numbers up because, they've already got an engaged audience, and some people prefer to listen versus watching. This just, again, it's different, but vice versa. Some people don't really like listening to podcasts; they prefer to watch YouTube videos. Different modes of communication, isn't it?
And yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And on the you touched on the data and bigger players coming into podcasting, and I'm generally a believer that when sometimes it's sad, but then it leads to growth, is when advertising grows in a specific sector. So when there's an opportunity to increase advertising and then more money's being spent in an industry, that's when you start to see things change. And as you said, more money is being put into the podcasting space.
Yes.
And so naturally, as the advertising dollars are spent, there is a desire to know what the return on investment is. And so that, I agree with that problem, by the way. The problem of analytics and data not being maybe universally understood has been a problem for a very long time. I'm curious, like you said, to see whether that does change as there are, podcast hosts, podcast platforms. You talked about celebrities, coming into that space. I'd imagine it would change. I really struggle to see how it will, but I'm curious to know how it will. Are there any other changes that you think maybe are coming to podcasting over these next few years? Anything that podcasters should be thinking about, listeners should be thinking about?
I mean, it's a good question. I can't predict the future. I can't predict the future. I wish I could, because I'd make loads of money then. But it's one of these things. I think there are companies that are trying to sort of change it in different ways. There's a company called Luminary that have had tons and tons of investment. They're trying to create almost like a Netflix for podcasts. I think the impression I get is they're struggling. I don't think that's the way of doing it. And part of the beauty of the medium is it is like this open format. It's not like YouTube where it's this sort of closed environment where you're just bound by their terms and conditions. I think that's what makes it exciting, is that we're not just on Spotify. There's Spotify, there's Apple, there's Google, and they are obviously the three key players in terms of consumption. Google, interestingly, are very late to the party. Spotify have managed to suck up a big chunk of the market within a very short space of time, because 3 years ago on Spotify, you couldn't listen to podcasts. They only introduced it, I think, in 2018. Google have finally sort of started to get a bit of momentum. Obviously, you mentioned you use Google Podcasts, but I think, again, it's just one of these weird sort of things that there's not been one sort of single player that seems to have kind of managed to gobble up the market. Apple really did have that for a long time, and I think they neglected it. I just think they got sort of complacent. They didn't really innovate or update the space. They just had most people listening to podcasts through iTunes, because the name podcast, I guess, stems from their sort of system in any way. So Spotify really just did come in and catch them by surprise a bit. That's my perspective on it. But how's it going to change over the next few years? I don't know. I mean, I think it's not going away, that's for sure. It's certainly being adopted by a wider audience than, say, 5 years ago, and that I think is a good thing. So there's going to be more. There's just going to be a lot more content. It's going to become more competitive for sure. That's the only thing I can sort of think of, really.
Yeah, competition is interesting. There's something you said that really I've never thought about, but there's the freedom of podcasting means you're not bound to one particular platform, and it's not. And I agree with you. You really just opened my mind in terms of I've never really thought about it. But when you're a vlogger or something, or you're hosting something on YouTube, you are bound to that platform. Absolutely. And YouTube's terms and conditions.
Likewise with Facebook, a few years ago, there was loads of company that Facebook changed their algorithm, and suddenly organic engagement and organic reach on your Facebook page posts went hugely down. And there were companies that built their businesses solely on having Facebook pages. So with podcasting, there is that good thing that, you're not under their mercy, and you're not under their terms and conditions. Again, Facebook don't like you, they can switch you off within an instant. So could YouTube, so there are people who have lost out big time when what happens, because they've just done something silly to violate the terms of service or whatever, and you suddenly spent 2 or 3 years building an audience, and that's just gone. So this is I think why there is a bit of a difference in the marketplace, and I hope it stays like that, because this is the worst thing will be is if one just somehow managed to completely engulf it, and then you lose that freedom, because suddenly you can't say this and you can't say that, and you can have that advertiser, you can't have this one. So that's the good thing about the medium. It's proper like people's media.
Yeah, no, it really is, and I hadn't really thought about it and also the other point that you touched on, and I'll close on this point because I know you've got other podcasts to get to today. You've got a very busy day. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the challenge. But it's just come to mind that Apple had the stronghold on the podcast market. And it's very rare you think about this, that Apple losing market share. But you're completely right. I'd never thought about it, but they had the podcast sector, they had iTunes, and then over the last few years, they have lost that to Spotify, now to Google Podcasts, Stitcher and so forth. And the variety of platforms makes it really good as a podcaster. And like you said, I agree. I think that's a really good thing, because it keeps podcasting. It allows a bit more freedom in podcasting and doesn't keep you bound to one platform. I'm hoping it stays that way too. James, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning on both podcasts. I'm really looking forward to. I'm going to check out the other podcasts that you've been talking about on this episode, but also as part of your challenge. I'm going to wish you the best for the rest of your challenge. I think it's a fascinating challenge, and just thanks for your contributions to the podcast space. It's made my life easier. It's given me a new medium to communicate through, and lots of motivation to do so. And thanks for your time today. Appreciate it, Scott. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you, and really interesting conversation. So thanks for having me on. No problem. Can you just remind guests where they can find you and all of your platforms? Yeah, of course. Podcast.co is where you can start your own podcast. Matchmaker.fm is the service to connect podcasters and guests. And if you want to connect with me personally, if you go to jamesm.com, that's jamesm for Mike.com/connect, jamesm.com/connect. That's where all my social media profiles are listed, and I'm pushing out all sorts of content and cool things on there as well. Brilliant. So this has been the first episode or guest-based episode of the Advertising Hour. Hope you enjoyed it. Please give me feedback. And I'm hosted on the podcast.co platform, so you can find me there. Thanks, everyone.